Our main example of the vaccine efficacy cheap trick was based on the assumption that those who tested positive for infection within a short period after vaccination, for example 7, 14 or 21 days, were classified as unvaccinated. We showed that in a typical mass placebo vaccine rollout, this cheap trick guarantees the illusion of efficacy, starting at over 90% before gradually waning to less than 20% after 3 months. Now, we made it clear that this assumption wasn't made in all the observational studies and randomised control trials that claim efficacy of the COVID vaccines, but it was just one of the many variants of the cheap trick that all lead to exaggerated efficacy claims. However, many said that our example was unfair because it was more likely that cases shortly after vaccination would simply be excluded, i.e. not counted at all, rather than classified as unvaccinated. Well, it turns out that this type of exclusion still leads to high efficacy claims. So in the example presented here, we're going to assume there's a population of 110,000, of whom 100,000 get vaccinated in a typical ramp-up vaccination period over a period of 11 weeks. So what we have is in week 1, 1,000 of the 100,000 get vaccinated. In week 2, 2,000 of them get vaccinated, etc., peaking at 30,000 in week 6. Until in week 10, we've got 100,000. So total ever vaxxed totals to 100,000 out of the 110,000. For the unvaccinated, we're simply subtracting the total people, which is 110,000, minus the number that are vaccinated each week. We're assuming that this is a placebo vaccine. So there's a weekly infection rate, which we're assuming is consistent throughout. We're assuming that's 1%. And I'll show you it makes no difference, that assumption, to the overall results. So for both the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, 1% each week get infected. But what we're assuming is for the vaccinated, a person doesn't count as fully vaccinated until after, first we're going to do it 1 week, then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks. So in the 1 week case, in the first week, you've got 1,000 newly vaccinated, of whom 1%, that's 10, will become infected. But because that's within 1 week, we're not going to classify those as unvaccinated. We're simply not going to count them. So we've got no cases of fully vaccinated in week 1. When it gets to week 2, the only people who are now fully vaccinated were the ones from week 1. So the fully vaccinated now are from the cumulative ever vaccinated, which is 1,000. Although we've now got 3,000 vaccinated in week 2, meaning 30 new cases, we're again going to dismiss the 20 new cases arising from the 2,000 newly vaccinated, and that leaves only 10 from the fully vaccinated. In week 3, we've now got the 3,000 who were vaccinated up to week 2 and now counting as fully vaccinated, and of those there will be 30 cases, etc. Now the vaccine effectiveness score each week is simply 1 minus the weekly reported infection rate of the vaccinated divided by the weekly infection rate of the unvaccinated, which should really be 1 minus 1 over 1, which is 0. But of course, because of the delay in counting the vaccinated cases, it's above 0. We don't consider the first week because nobody's considered fully vaccinated then. But in week 2, you've got 67%, gradually going down until week 9, we're less than 10%. Then we go on to the second case, which are those where we ignore cases within 2 weeks of vaccination. And it's exactly the same, except the shift now is that we've got to wait till week 3 for those first 1,000 to be considered fully vaccinated, and week 4 for the 3,000 vaccinated in the first 2 weeks to be fully vaccinated, etc. And that has the effect that we don't count anything in the first 2 weeks because nobody's considered to be fully vaccinated. But in week 3, we start at a 86% vaccine effectiveness rate, which doesn't drop to below 20% until week 9. And we can go on. The third case is where you don't consider someone to be fully vaccinated until 3 weeks after vaccination, which is exactly the Office for National Statistics definition used in their vaccine efficacy calculation. So now we have to wait until week 4 before we count those who are vaccinated in week 1 as fully vaccinated, week 5 before we count those in the first 2 weeks, etc. And what you can see now is that the vaccine effectiveness starts off in week 4 at 94% and doesn't drop to below 20% until week 10. And what I can show you is that there's the graph of the 1, 2 and 3 week delay efficacy plots. If I change that weekly infection rate, for example, to 2%, you'll see an increase in the number of cases, of course, but the vaccine efficacy score stays exactly the same. So even if we forget about this misclassification problem, i.e. we're not counting those recently vaccinated cases as unvaccinated, we're simply discounting them completely, we still get this cheap trick, the vaccine efficacy illusion, especially when we're into that 3-week delay of a very highly effective vaccine in the first few weeks, kind of like waiting almost 3 months before you're seeing very low efficacy. But it turns out we actually still get the vaccine efficacy illusion, even if we've got a negative efficacy vaccine, i.e. a vaccine which is not a placebo, but which is worse than a placebo. So this is the case where we're assuming everything's the same, but in this case, we're assuming the vaccine actually induces a higher infection rate, 1.25%, instead of the base rate of 1% for the unvaccinated. So everything's exactly the same, except for the vaccinated, the weekly infection rate uses the 1.25 rather than the 1%. And what you can see in this case is that even with just a 1-week delay, you still have reasonably high efficacy, 58% in week 2, and it doesn't drop into negative territory until week 8, even though this is a consistently negative efficacy vaccine. That 1-week delay is creating the illusion. And if you go on to the 2-week delay, you're up to 82% in week 3 before it drops off negative week 9. And in the case of the 3-week delay, as per the ONS definition, wow, even with a negative efficacy vaccine, a vaccine which is worse than a placebo, we're at 93% efficacy starting in week 4 and continuing quite high, only dropping in negative territory by week 10. And there you can see the plot. Even if we push that up to 1.5%, so this is a vaccine which has an infection rate 50% above the base rate, you can see that you've still got these positive efficacy figures. In fact, in the case of the 3-week delay, we're still starting at over 90% efficacy for a vaccine which has a 50% infection rate above the normal infection rate. So for both a placebo and an ineffective vaccine, which enhances infectivity, the cheap trick, simply by exclusion, guarantees a high efficacy which wanes until a point when a booster is required to restore efficacy and enhance profits.